welcome to the podcast. Kate, it's really good to have you, and you're such a busy person. So the fact that we were able to have you on and find a time that we're both available is not a small thing.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so thank you for coming and speaking today. And and obviously I've been kind of this maternal mental health awareness week has created
Mm.
a series of I guess episodes on the subject, but um I'm obviously it'll be quite nice to hear a little bit about your background for listeners, so they know. I mean, you've got two kids, but obviously you've set up Birth Trauma Aotearoa, and maybe you just want to share a little bit about how and why that happened, and your family situation, perhaps, if you want to.
Sure. So Birth Trauma Aotearoa is kind of this phase 2 of my mahi in this space. About 7 years ago, I had a tricky birth experience myself, and while trying to kind of figure out what was going on in my head and my heart at the time, I looked for resources to help me figure
Mm,
that out, to kind of offer comfort and reassurance, and really found nothing that helped me
mm,
make sense of it all. I found a lot around postnatal depression, a lot around postnatal anxiety, and a little bit overseas, but nothing that really fit the context here in Aotearoa.
mm,
So, in my infinite wisdom, I decided to create something, and
mm,
took the next 2 years to create the My Birth Story website, which is a birth trauma support website for mums, whānau, birthing parents here in Aotearoa. So
mm,
I launched that just before I had my second baby. And what I found kind of naturally happened is that my work kind of evolved to include advocacy and education around birth trauma.
mm,
And so, again, in my infinite wisdom, being a sucker for punishment, I decided that what really needed to happen next was to have an organisation that really championed um, kind of the birth trauma cause, if you like, and
yeah.
champion the community and the community's needs. Um, yeah, and so about a year and a half ago, pulled together Birth Trauma Aotearoa, which is effectively just me doing this work in my spare time as a full-time mum. And we also have a board of 5 other wonderful women with a huge kind of diversity of background, everything from Māori maternities through to health justice and medical ethics, running grassroots organisations and running kaupapa Māori maternal health support programs. So an incredible mix of people sitting around
Mm,
our table. So yeah, we're
amazing.
quite busy, but,
Yeah,
but
yeah, and it's all voluntary.
yeah, it is. And it was
Yeah,
interesting listening
yeah.
to your own your own kind of session on the last podcast episode, and
Mm,
it's kind of very similar beginnings, hey, between Mothers Helpers
yeah,
and Birth
yeah,
Trauma Aotearoa. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, honestly, Mother's Helpers, I don't know how many years it was voluntary. It was a lot of years, at least five, before I even got a part-time income.
Mm,
And there were times where I was working full-time voluntary, while studying and having a little boy to look after.
yeah.
So yeah, yeah. It's not an easy road. Um, yeah, and quite often when it comes to funding, you often don't get funding until you've been established for quite some time, because
Mm,
so many charities start up and kind of fall away within a very short space of time. So it's almost like they want to watch you to see if you're
yeah.
going to last the distance, which is really hard. It's
Yeah.
not easy being a charity in New Zealand. Yeah. So, okay, so you've when did you? I'm sort of wondering how you set it up right before your second was born. How old are your kids?
Birth Trauma Aotearoa has only been around for about a year and a half, but the
Yeah.
website I launched about almost 5 years ago. Yep, so I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, almost 5-year-old. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, and they definitely keep me on my toes. Really
cool. And how much do you want to sort of share about your own experiences? That because I realise that, I mean, even I don't like talking, even though I feel like I've recovered from the majority of it. It's not something I like to talk about. How do you feel about it with your story?
Yeah, I don't tend to share too much detail about my personal story, and partly that's because you know, I'm kind of so far in this space, and also and I try to kind of keep my private life separate to my work life, I suppose. And also I'm mindful it's not just my story, you know, it's my child's story as well.
That's right.
So yeah, and I, you know, they're not at an age yet where I can kind of
talk to them
ask
about
them
it
if they're happy for me to share it. Yeah, but I do share that it included a kind of hasty move from home to hospital, and an emergency cesarean, and then NICU time as well. So there's a few elements in there which are pretty kind of hefty.
Yeah. You know, we're coming up to Maternal Mental Health Awareness Week, and the last kind of episode, which was cut into part 1 and 2 because I talk too much. You know, I just shared from my experience, my journey of what I was aware of in terms of gaps and how I tried to respond to that and tried to create awareness around that and resourcing and change some of the you know, not alone with lots of other people's input. And I'm just wondering, you know, from your point of view, you know, were there some things, because I know that you've listened to the episodes as you're listening, you know, I guess first question is, you know, what was your response? And second question, you know, what would you add to that picture of you know, the needs that are there?
Why are all these vital services and organisations raising awareness, providing, you know, on the ground support services? Why are we having to struggle for funding when again it's such vital work? And you know,
100%.
You kind of sung that song too, right? And
I sometimes get that kind of response from funders. Like I remember very early on applying, because I was not experienced with funding applications, and I just sort of applied everywhere that I could. And I remember going to the council, which is not necessarily a good fit for this kind of thing, but you know, finding, you know, the I won't say who, but you know, a parenting organization go ahead of me and get a lot of money, and then me sitting in front of the council and sharing, and they were saying to me, why isn't this covered by health? Because it's a health issue. It's not an add-on. It's not an add-on issue. It's a really vital issue, as you've said. Yeah, so it is. It's kind of, I was like, well, that's a good question, but that's not why I'm here. You know, like I'm
the reality.
Here to about it. Not, yeah, but their response is this should be covered by government, not council. Yeah, central government. Yeah.
And it, you know, it continues to baffle me because we continue to hear more and more and more evidence and more research and more reports that tell us about the value of maternal health as opposed to maternal ill health, and yet the solutions are just still, you know, kind of just not supported adequately at all. It boggles me sometimes, hey. And you know, also, you know, you talked about in your episode you know, the services kind of going or being focused a lot on the most kind of severe illness, which absolutely, of course, that's needed. But we also need to look upstream. We also need to look upstream and go, why are people getting so unwell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's not enough going into that space, although there's been some effort. Yeah, I don't know if it's really meeting the needs of maternal mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you know, it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because, you know, you can have we can talk and we can resource and we can look at mental health generally, and of course that's hugely important as well. But when we're looking at, I think the thing that we forget is that when we're looking at maternal mental health, we're not just looking at the individual. We're looking at, as you know, the baby, the child, the partner, the whole whānau. And really, in my mind, the way that we support maternal mental health or maternal health generally is about, it really shows us the value that we place on whānau, because you know, mothers, parents are so central to the well-being of a whole family, of a whole whānau unit. And I just think that we can't underestimate kind of the value of parents, of mothers. That's not being met in terms of the value of the resourcing that's put towards
actually,
this.
as you're saying that reminds me of, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with these, but you know, as a social worker, you know, we were trained in the whanawhale model for Pacifica, and Te Whare Tapawha for Māori, which is kind of based on Mason Jury. Well, yeah, he developed it anyway. And it's just, you know, there is a lot of desire to, you know, do, you know, kind of really meet the needs of Māori and Pacifica, because they often, you know, high in our statistics of suicide, high in our statistics of maternal deaths by suicide, you know, not accessing, you know, lower rates of accessing, you know, midwifery care or health care, or, you know, all these things. And in those models, which are designed by that community, whānau, you know, in the whanawhale model, if you're not familiar with it, it's just like they've got the I can't remember what I think it's a whare in Pacifica as well, but it's, you know, it's got the posts of whale, that's it, and they've got the posts. If you've ever been to Pacific Islands, which you know, I have had the good fortune of going to Samoa, and you see these beautiful whales everywhere, and there's these roof, and you know, and these posts, and they have all the posts in this model represent something that's really important to their culture, and one of them is whānau. And if one of the posts is not supported, then the whale kind of tips over. And it's the same principle in Te Whare Tapawha, which is kind of like the walls of the house of the whare, and whānau is part of that too. So I think that's a really good point that you raise, that it's such a vital part of well-being and health, and particularly in our Māori and Pacifica cultures, and yet we're not doing a very good job with that.
You know, I think something that I kind of often say when speaking with people about this is that often whānau know, you know, families know what they need. Families know what the solutions are for themselves. Sometimes we need a little bit more guidance to kind of figure that out. But we often know, right? We just need a little bit of support to get there sometimes. So I don't think we can underestimate our own knowing, and and again, it's about the value that we place upon that, right? And how
Yeah,
how we
yeah,
how we show that value, i.e. in
yeah,
resourcing or care or what have
yeah,
you. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, 100%. And yeah, and do you feel there'll be things that, you know, I didn't really talk a lot about birth trauma. Um,
Mm.
what would you add to that picture in terms of gaps? I mean, you mentioned before that, you know, your own experience, you looked for support and it wasn't there, and I know that is
Mm.
that to be a fact. Um, Particularly because with Mothers Helpers, we didn't used to address it because we were so busy. We wanted to do what we were doing really well. But the thing is that so we would test for signs of PTSD or you know,
Mm.
and we would find signs of PTSD, and then we would try and refer that person for help. And we were struggling. We would try and refer them to maternal mental health. We would show
Mm.
the impact event score, which was showing signs of PTSD. One of the reasons we would send them there is for partly for a diagnosis to be assessed.
Mm.
If there's a diagnosis of PTSD, because once they have that, then they can look at treatment. Um, and quite often, often with maternal mental health, you have to go through they use their generally use their community mental health team to do the assessment. So they're not specialised in order to get to maternal
Mm.
mental health, you have to pass the gateway of the general community mental health. You can't go just straight directly to maternal mental health. So their knowledge on maternal mental health
Mhm.
is a lot less than those in maternal mental health. So very often I would be having conversations with maternal mental health saying, yes, we would accept them, and the community team saying, no, they don't meet the criteria for maternal mental health. So
Mm.
I would have to have this conversation saying, well, I've already spoken to maternal mental health and they've already said that they would accept her. So, and that's kind of, but, you know, without that advocacy, you know, they
Mm.
would just be blind. And so then you've got someone with PTSD symptoms with no help at all, which to
Yeah.
me, again,
Yeah.
blows my mind. And so we would say to them, well, we want to get you specialist help, you know, because we want to make sure, because not all, and I say this with the greatest respect, because quite often counsellors feel like they have the ability to deal with trauma, but there are many instances where they actually contribute
Mm.
to the trauma because they're
Mm.
not fully trained in it. So we would try and refer them to counsellors that we knew would have really good training on trauma, especially mind body work and things like that. And they're all
Mm.
full and, you know, expensive. And so this is why we ended up training in trauma ourselves
Mm.
and started
Right.
delivering some private counselling. Even it's low cost and it's better but not
Mm.
perfect. But yeah, I mean that's what's
Yeah,
your
it's a few things. My mind's kind of pinging as you
yeah
talk, but
thinking. Mm,
it's the part of the reason that I set up Birth Trauma Aotearoa was to essentially fly the flag and and in the places that it needed to be flowing. Needs
mm,
because it hasn't finished yet by any stretch of the imagination. But and what I mean by that is there is so little understanding and so little acknowledgement of birth trauma as a thing, right
right.
from GPs through to birth professionals, through to your own mother, through to in our communities, people just are only now is it really getting airtime. Only now are we
Mm,
coming to kind of understand it, talk about it, use the words birth trauma,
yeah,
um, and
that's a
that's
fair point.
and that's really part of our job as an organisation,
Mm,
is to say this is a thing. It happens for various reasons. You are valid in your for the individuals. You are valid in your
yeah,
feelings. about your birth, and you absolutely deserve support. And the other side of our job as an organisation is to then go and advocate for those support services to make sure that they're easily accessible, that they're equitable, that they're effective, and so on. And, you know, I can say easy to access, you know, effective, equitable, and so on, but there's a lot more that needs to kind of happen behind the scenes to make those simple words the case. And again, that's our job, right? I feel like birth trauma is kind of where postnatal depression and anxiety was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Like, it's really only just kind of coming into the light.
Well, that's now. Kind of grim in a way, because as you can see, probably from my last episode, you know, that we're not doing that well. The awareness is growing, but we're not doing well with maternal mental health still. And you know, like, as I said, we're starting to see movement, but that's in the 12 years that I've been working in that space. To see a tiny bit of movement after that length of time, it's hard, super hard.
Bet. Yeah. And it's
so yeah, I feel but I hear what you're saying, because I think I think it's a really good point to say that we don't talk about it. We don't use the language, we don't use the words. And one of the things quite early on was that I trained my staff to ask the question, would you describe your birth experience as traumatic? Which is just one question that can actually be a really helpful question for anybody working in that space.
And also, people don't think about it themselves, I think, because it's not talked about.
They don't.
It's not common. People don't kind of stop and go, oh, maybe that was what's going on for me.
Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah, and I actually would love to do, and I have no idea how we're going to do it, but I have a big long list of research projects that I'd love to see done, and one of them is looking at essentially the misdiagnosis of postnatal depression and postnatal anxiety, whereas it's actually trauma. It's actually birth 100%. Trauma, and because we don't think about it, because you know. GPs or Plunkett nurses or whoever are not, it's just not on people's radar. And so when somebody presents at the GP or to their kaiwhena or a Plunkett nurse, and shares their distress with that person, with that practitioner, it's just not on people's radar. So instead of going, well, how was your birth experience? How would you describe that? How has it impacted you? We kind of often go off to, well, it must be postnatal depression, and that's not to dismiss those experiences at all, but I think we need to be really mindful of the impact that negative and traumatic birth experiences can have, and how that may then present very similarly to postnatal depression and postnatal anxiety. We just need to be asking the questions.
I do see that people can have both. So people can
totally, absolutely.
And trauma being the cause of the. It's almost like, it's often when I'm working with someone with signs of PTSD, or at least trauma in response to their birth experience, I often say to them, we really need to address that first, and then we can see, you know, what's then left, you know, and is that depression actually reducing because we're dealing with the cause of the depression, and the depression's kind of almost like a secondary condition to the trauma.
And I think that, you know, generally we need to be thinking about trauma anyway, in kind of regards to all health and well-being, because trauma is that kind of strange beast where if you have one trauma, then another trauma kind of compounds the first, right? So for example, I experienced both the Christchurch and the Kaikoura earthquakes right there at the epicenter. It's like, well, how much do they play off against each other? Yeah, so I think we just need to be asking the questions. We just need to be thinking about trauma in general, and particularly birth trauma when it comes to maternal mental health, and paternal mental health, because we need to acknowledge also that dads and other parents and support people can also have negative birth experiences in their support role, and can also be impacted.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also it's really, I feel like there are often themes in people's trauma experiences. No one story is the same, but there are definitely themes. And I'm trying to think, I think I read a massive, I don't remember whether it was a report. I think it was a report done by TABS, which is,
right,
you probably are
trauma
familiar
and
with
birth stress.
Yeah, and you've probably read the document. It's huge, and it was this huge survey of women's experience, mothers' experiences of traumatic birth, and there were definitely some themes. And the person that founded that organization, which is really just a website, I think now, um, did some seminars and taught on those themes. And I mean, that's really helpful because, we do see the same or similar stories of, and especially when I'm doing counselling and debriefing, I'm hearing the same similar pattern of, I felt helpless, I felt powerless, I didn't have a voice. Um, no one asked me what I wanted in that moment. No one checked in to see if it was okay, and because I often ask what would have helped, because sometimes you're still going to have, possibly you may still have the emergency C-section, you may still have the NICU experience, you may have, whatever the horrible things are, but often the point of trauma, or it seems to me to be what really makes that trauma, or I guess really causes the huge impact, is that loss of voice, that loss of power, that loss of advocacy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I see those those insights, because that's absolutely what we see too, and what the little research sees as well and reports on. And what I see those kind of themes as opportunities. So opportunities where we can go in and prevent birth trauma from happening as best we
100%.
can,
Yeah.
because prevention is always better than cure, right? And so one thing that Birth Trauma Aotearoa is, one work area, I suppose, one thing we do is research. So we're looking at where the research gaps are, particularly for Aotearoa-based research, because, we have such a unique kind of context here. So looking at where the gaps are, looking at what the opportunities are, and really what we need to know about birth trauma in Aotearoa. Because, what we can measure, we can manage more effectively. So we need to, we've got, as I say, big long list of research projects that I want to get going. So
that's really good. It's really good that you're doing, you're working in that space, because it needs that single focus. It really needs that in order for that awareness to be growing. I'm really pleased that we're doing something in that space, because I know I did recognize that need, and I was aware of that need, and then there was a point at which it was like, we have to respond to this, because it's too connected to what our overall vision is. We need to be doing something, and there isn't enough being done in this space in secondary or primary services. It's so hard because, well, I mean, this is a question for you. In an ideal world, what would that look like for you? I mean, I kind of described a little bit about what would be the ideal for me. What would you add to that picture?
I think I'll check my list because there's a few things on it, and you know, totally tautoko what you said. I think that we need a much bigger focus on equity, because in my mind, where the barriers are, the resource needs to go. Not to take it away from other areas, but we need more resource in the areas where there are barriers. So for Māori communities, for rainbow communities, for disabled communities, for rural communities, and so on. So that needs to be a real focus, is equity of care and service. We need really robust research so that we can have a picture of what's going on. I think that we definitely need trauma-informed care. So, you know, your organisation has got that as a kind of a focus, but that's certainly not the same throughout other organisations.
No.
And certainly, I think, you know, the trauma-informed kind of care and trauma-informed approach needs to come right from policymakers, right through to kind of grassroots organisations at the coalface. Because if we're not looking at trauma, then we're missing half the picture. And I don't just mean birth trauma. I mean, as we said earlier, you know, a previous trauma as well. You've only got to look at the domestic violence and you know, intimate partner violence rates in Aotearoa, and many of us arrive at the birth space with previous trauma. So
absolutely.
In an ideal world, I think that we need a really big shift in attitudes, and that's something that our work really is trying to shift slowly, because I know that's going to be a long game. And by that I mean attitudes that kind of work towards creating that trauma, and then also attitudes that people who express distress, attitudes that they come up against when they express that distress.
That's so important.
For example,
that's an important point.
Attitudes such as, oh well, what did you expect? It's birth. Attitudes such as, well, you know, you thought your birth was bad, you should hear Sarah's down the road, or you know, attitudes like, well, at least ... kind of fill in the blank. At least baby
is healthy. At least your baby's alive and healthy.
Just all those incredibly dismissive kind of attitudes. I'd like to erase them, basically. And that's, I think, where.
And it's disappointing when it's coming from places that you would not expect it to come from. That adds a layer to it, because I think, you know, as I was talking when I've talked to, we've had a few stories over the last few weeks of you know, people who have had an experience of traumatic birth, and often those sorts of attitudes are coming from nurses, or they're coming from midwives, or they're coming from maternal mental health, or that, you know, and they're coming from places where you have that expectation that you would have compassion and understanding. I mean, and that is to me, that is kind of a valid expectation to have. So it's really, and I think when you're vulnerable, because you are vulnerable, aren't you, in this whole process? You know, and you're in the hands
time.
And you're in the hands of people that you need to be your advocate. You need to be them to be compassionate and understanding. It is quite a big part of the story when they're not.
It's and I think, you know, those attitudes, they're really at every level. Those attitudes exist right kind of at the policymaker, you know, government policymaker level. It's like, well, do we invest in this? It's like, well, is it? There's almost, to me, sometimes I feel like there's an attitude of, well, you brought it on yourself. and
Mm.
that's awful. It's awful to even say that, because that's really that attitude of, well, what did you expect when you got pregnant? Like,
Do you think
yeah,
it was going to be easy?
did you
Yeah.
think it was going to be a walk in the park? And
Yeah.
you talked about in your episode, where does it come from? Why has nothing changed? Why
Yeah.
have we
Yeah.
seen so little progress? And it made me laugh, actually, because I was writing down what I thought as you were
Mm.
speaking, and I wrote down, because it's a woman's issue, at the
Yeah.
exact same time that you were saying it, and I just thought,
Yeah.
oh, it is, it's just, it's, yeah, those
Because it's
attitudes are
exclusively, it is
irrelevant.
generally exclusively a woman's, because men don't give birth,
Mm,
and, recognizing being very binary here, recognizing that I'm being very binary here. But I do think because of that, and I just want to say, I want to be inclusive and say not everyone identifies as a woman who gives birth. Um,
absolutely.
but also just to say that because of that, I think you're right, but it sort of boggles my mind, because I think we're 2023. Like,
Mm,
surely it can't be that.
yeah.
I keep thinking it can't be that. Surely it can't be that, because we're so much more evolved. Yeah, I think it is that. Yeah.
I
So
think that it's just those attitudes around birth trauma, that I've mentioned, they're just so entrenched that we virtually don't even realize that they're there. And,
mm,
unless kind of someone asks you outright, I think those attitudes are there kind of subconsciously. And as I say, right from policymakers right through to, your cousin, when you say, oh, actually, I had a
yeah.
really rubbish time.
Or your mum, even your mum, yeah, but I had
Mm,
4 children.
yeah,
My
yeah, and
just
that's,
to say, my mum's had 4 children, and that wasn't her attitude, but just to
yeah, yeah,
but it happens,
disclaimer.
like, where
Yeah.
there's this kind of, this is what you do. This is all
Mm,
part of it, and we just
and
got
it's
on with it.
really,
Yeah,
really tough. It's really tough to hear those
it is.
attitudes, because they shut it down, right?
Mm,
There's an instant barrier to getting
mm,
support and reaching out for support. And we all kind of say, all the messaging is, well, if you're feeling down, just reach out for support. And it's like, well, how can we expect people to, if that's all they come
yes.
up against, is the dismissive
Yeah,
kind of attitudes that just minimize that experience,
yeah,
instead of saying, you know, that sounds really tough. How can I help? Or how can
yes,
I kind of support you? So that's,
yeah.
again, that's part of our job, is to kind
Yeah,
of quietly chip away at shifting those attitudes. Um,
yeah,
yeah, and that's a long game, because
yeah.
that's societal attitude,
It is.
stuff.
Yeah, you're
So,
right. And often
mm,
we come to form opinions based on our own experience. So if we've actually had a
mm,
really good, positive, supportive experience, we can't imagine what it might be like for someone who hasn't had that. Um,
mm,
so, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, it's learning how to listen to other people's experience and
mm,
ask the question, what can I what could I do that would be helpful right
mm,
now, or what do you need right now, and listening to that. I feel
mm,
quite often, especially and that's in a kind of personal space, friends, family,
mm,
but also I think in the professional space, sometimes we can be quite defensive of,
mm,
we just want to say, well, yeah, but the reason that happened was because
mm,
of this, or the reason and it's sort of, it can be really hard to hear um someone's experience without being defensive about that. But how are we
mm,
going to change anything if we
mm.
will not listen? um
Yeah. And
Yeah.
you know, those kind of comments are often really judgment kind of laden, I think.
Yeah.
And that's a hard nut to crack. But
Yeah.
we'll keep ticking away.
I think, you know, that's the thing, that dismissive and defensive kind of thing. And I just keep, you know, I remember that judgment, as you say, like, you know, the midwife that I had who described me in a letter to the Health and Disability Commissioner as as an overly anxious mother, which is
Mm,
it's a judgmental statement. And
mm,
in fact, if we reworded that, I was a mother who, in pregnancy, expecting mother who had undiagnosed clinical anxiety
mm,
was actually the truth. So yeah, it's just I think there is this kind of labeling and judging of people, particularly
mm.
if they're not coping. And so, and then mothers themselves judge themselves and
Oh, the
expect
most harsh.
themselves to
Yeah.
cope. And then
Mm,
they meet people who also judge them too. So that's really, really hard. And we can change that. And I really
mm,
appreciate the work that you're doing to change that. Yeah. As a
mm.
society, you're right. It's got to be. It's more than just the system, the health system. It's got to be a societal change in attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything
So
you would want to add to this
the
story, to
blue
this,
sky,
yeah,
the
conversation?
blue
Yeah,
sky.
before we wrap it
Gosh,
up. Yeah.
um, I've got a long list, but I think, you know, really a well-resourced maternity sector is just so vital. You know,
Mm,
a lot of the time we hear stories about negative experiences coming from just a lack of staff, a lack of time able to be spent with health, you know, between healthcare professional and the birthing parent. And because of that lack of staff and time, there's just such a lack of relationship or trust that's able to be built between the birthing person and the midwife or the you know, the LMC. And
mm,
that can kind of lead to so many other challenges within the labour and birthing, sorry, the pregnancy and birthing kind of context. So
mm,
a well-resourced sector is just a must, and that
yeah,
includes, you know, postnatal support when
mm,
things don't go right. One policy that we are calling for is for every birthing person after every birth, whether that's a loss or a live birth, for every person to have physical checkups and psychological checkups, no matter what
mm,
you are offered them,
mm,
and they can happen kind of immediately or you know,
yeah,
many years down the track, because with birth trauma, it's not recognised. You know, people don't
mm,
recognise they're feeling negatively for many
yeah,
years to come. So
mm,
yeah, that support's got to be not time bound, I guess. So
yeah.
mm,
So, just two, I guess, quick questions. One is, where would you, if someone was going onto your website, and what would
mm,
they, and you know, they thought they might have experienced a traumatic birth, what might
mm.
they expect to see when they get to your website?
Um, the My Birth Story website is really a place of kind of comfort. It's one that
Mm,
offers comfort and reassurance. So there's kind of information about birth trauma. There's a piece written by a psychologist about, you know, kind of more detail about what happens in our brain and our body when we experience a
mm,
traumatic event. There's a kaupapa tikanga Māori section. There's information for fathers and support people and other parents. There's information about getting pregnant again, and there's a whole bunch more, and importantly, there's a really long list of kind of external support organisations and individuals. So there is also a page of what I call strategies, so kind of some things that people can do at home just with themselves to kind of begin that process. But then if they need extra support, there's a big long list there
of
of people they can reach out to.
That's great. And can you just let the listeners know where they can find you, where they can find that website?
Yeah, so that's mybirthstory.org.nz, and Birth Trauma Aotearoa. We don't have a website yet, it's in the making, but we do have a Facebook page, so that's just Birth Trauma Aotearoa on Facebook. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I know that there's so much more that we could talk about here, especially because, you know, especially this is our area, you know, when you get people talking about the area of their passion, you know, there's so much to say, but I just really want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing in this space and the awareness that you're trying to create, the change that you're trying to create in the space, because I know what that's like to work really hard in a voluntary space as a full-time mum. Personally, you know, we really appreciate you from a mother's helper's perspective. So thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. It's an honour really to do this work. It's an honour.